Hello, and welcome to Distant Echoes, New Mexico 31, Juan Bautista de Anza. Last time we talked about the ways the Spanish reorganized the government in the late colonial period. This time I thought we'd take a look at the man who perhaps best embodied the Bourbon Reforms, New Mexican Governor Juan Bautista de Anza, who was governor of New Mexico from 1777 to 1787. As governor, Anza would push the socioeconomic changes demanded by the Bourbon Reforms. King Carlos III also tried to assert authority over the colonial criollos through these reforms. The criollos were pure-blooded Spaniards born in the colonies. Carlos III was trying to promote and employ those who put the needs of the state above personal gain, and in many ways he could not have found a more able servant than Juan Bautista de Anza. One downside of the Bourbon Reforms that was overlooked was that it was expensive to maintain an empire, and that burden often fell on the colonials, who felt that it was unfair. To quote Lynch, "They gained a revenue and lost an empire." End quote. To sum up the dichotomy of the Bourbon Reforms in New Mexico, the purpose of New Mexico was to defend Zacatecas and other income-producing areas further south of it, and it had failed to do that in the early 1700s. The Bourbons also sought to better integrate it into the empire by doing things such as cutting down on illegal trade with areas such as the United States. In return, New Mexico would resist these attempts at lowering their autonomy. To quote Harry W. Crosby, quote, "The new regime initiated a campaign to return scattered authority to Madrid by reducing the influence of provincial nobles and cutting back on special privileges that had been retained by or granted to particular regions of Spain." End quote. The big changes during Anza's administration is that he did increase the communication between New Mexico and other provinces, reduce the Franciscans' power in New Mexico, introduced a policy of assimilation that gave the Native Americans little choice in their future, essentially offering them a choice of accept peace or be put to the sword. He basically conscripted people into the army, introduced a building code that made the colony look more like a military camp, reformed the corrupt food distribution system among the professional soldiers, and perhaps most importantly, he forged the Comanche Peace. Before we can get into his achievements, let's look at what forged him into the man that would so ably serve the Spanish crown, his youth in Sonora that helped hone the skills he'd need to be successful as governor of New Mexico. In Sonora, war was endemic. In the harsh desert, there was limited water and arable land, which led to conflict between the different groups. Sonoran indigenous groups were nomadic, semi-nomadic, or settled as their needs demanded. In the far north, they moved from water source to water source, setting up temporary farmsteads. Some groups to the south were more settled, but overall they never had enough of that precious water to go around. By the 1500s, they also had to compete with the horse cultures as they pushed into the region from the plains. This encroachment by the plains tribes led some of these groups to form alliances with the Spanish to resist these new rivals. The Spanish expansion north after the Mixton War was what finally allowed the Spanish to push into the region, though. They used a mission system to establish communities where the indigenous people that wanted to stay and convert were provided with material goods they wanted. At least on paper, that was how the system was supposed to work. The truth was, the goal of the missions was to annihilate indigenous cultures and turn them into loyal, Christian, Spanish subjects. The system also led to those that joined it becoming dependent on the missions. After the expulsion of the Jesuits, the native peoples of the area were essentially turned into peasant labor and were subject to even more abuses. The presidial system at the time was essentially a border patrol. It was mostly to deal with raids and keep people from moving south. The Villa Sur affair, which we talked about in episode 24, would raise questions as to the effectiveness of the presidial system and was what sparked reforms of it that we've talked about. In Sonora, the Pimas would revolt in late 1752 or early 1753. This was sparked mostly by forced relocations as well as other abuses by the Spanish. After the end of this revolt, the Spanish would change tactics. They would try to invite indigenous people into the Spanish settlements, not by force. They also would move the Sobapuris, and this would remove a buffer between Spanish lands and the Apaches. And the Apaches would come to see the violence they used as a way to stem further European encroachment into their territory. Anza's father, also named Juan Bautista de Anza, would join the army at 16 in the 1720s. This would prove a fortuitous time to join, as the 1720s was right when hostility was about to break out throughout Sonora and would allow him to lead a successful military career. He was also a supporter of the Jesuits in Sonora, something he seemed to have rubbed off on his son. In October 1736, silver would be discovered in Primeria Alta. This finding would spark a silver rush, and Anza's father was in charge of figuring out how much of this found silver belonged to the crown. Anza suspected that it was not virgin silver, but a buried hoard, either by quote-unquote indios antiguos, a common story, or a secret smelting operation. If it was from a deposit, whoever filed a legal claim would have much of it, with the crown only taking its share. If it was not, it was all for the crown. The investigation would shift to the viceroy's fiscal, who would determine it was not a deposit. Anza would be tasked with putting the matter to rest, though, after appeal. He determined it was a deposit and claims could be struck. This silver was the event that secured the Spanish presence in the region, but their settlements were still isolated. 1740, the Yaquis revolted, and this was also when Anza's father would die. Juan Bautista de Anza, the future governor of New Mexico, was 4 when his father died. His father had become a hero in his death, though. He would have several figures that would help build him into them, prepare him for his future career. Father Carlos Roxas, a Jesuit, may have served as an influential father figure to the young Anza. His brother-in-law, Gabriel Antonio de Vidasola, prepared him for his military career. Max L. Moore had described the kind of soldier Juan Bautista Anza would become. Quote, "The troops who manned the frontier presidios comprised a unique branch of the armed forces, distinct from Spain's regular soldiers, from the colonial militia, and from the civilians who were occasionally mobilized for military service. On the one hand, their deficiency in military instruction and discipline was such as to appall the regular army officers who inspected their units. On the other, those who were their comrades came to admire their toughness and stamina. They were neither elite troops nor raw recruits, but hard-bitten, homegrown vaqueros who were at ease in the saddle, inured to the harsh and lonely terrain in which they served, and accustomed to the cruel and unconventional tactics of Indian warfare." End quote. Anza would have the drive to excel as a soldier, and in 1756 the Pimas would again rise in revolt. By 1760 he had become the captain and commander of the Presidio of Tubac. He somehow met Ana Maria Perez Serrano, but exactly how he met her is unclear, and he began courting her. By law, he had to submit a formal request to his commander to marry. His superior governor and Captain General Juan de Mendoza would be killed late in 1760, 5 months before he would submit his request. He thus got the help of Father Felipe de Sigueser, of Sigueserhide fame, to intercede on his behalf. Juan de Anza was married on the 24th of June, 1761. In 1763, the residents of San Luis Valley would relocate to Tubac and Terrante to try and avoid the growing Apache raids. Anza would submit a plan to relocate the Sobapuris again, this time from around Tucson to the San Luis Valley, as they had been complaining to him about inadequate farmland and water. This would also allow them to serve as a buffer region between the Apaches and the Spanish once again. It would eventually come to naught, though. The Jesuits, to protect their missions, instead argued that the Papagos should be relocated. In 1776, he began to lead offenses against the Apaches. He had also begun to openly welcome indigenous allies into his forces as auxiliaries, letting them share equally in the spoils of war. His tactics would also be approved by the Marquis de Ruby. Ruby noted that Anza had not abused his rank. Anza possessed the qualities the Bourbons were looking for in their leaders: ingenuity, motivation, and enthusiasm. In 1767, his loyalty would be put to the test, though, when Carlos III ordered all the Jesuits rounded up and exiled from the empire. The Padres had been accused of inciting bread riots in Madrid in 1766, and overall, Carlos III believed that the Jesuits were more loyal to the Pope than to him. He even feared they plotted against him. He also understood that their mission system had failed in turning indigenous groups into tax-paying citizens. In Sonora, it was undertaken with secrecy and caution. Bernardo de Urrea was ordered to oversee the order, and he commanded his captains to execute the arrests. There were concerns that these arrests would spark an uprising among Jesuit loyalists, but Anza might be a useful tool to diffusing the situation, should it seem to be trying to arise. Anza, due to his close ties with influential Jesuits like Carlos Roxas, may have been able to help make the expulsion more orderly. He may also sway the colonists to the Jesuits' side, should he refuse the order. Pineda, the governor of Sonora, would note in the orders that this act would help prove his fealty to the crown. On July 25, 1767, he went to meet with Father Roxas. He gave Roxas instructions to have all the Padres gather in Matape. From there, they would be sent to the port of Guaymas, where they would live under house arrest until they could be transported to central New Spain, and from there out of the Spanish Empire entirely. Anza carried out his orders without incident. He would sum up his feelings on the affair to the governor. Quote, "After all, the king commands it, and there may be more to it than we realize. The thoughts of men differ as much as the distance from earth to heaven." End quote. In 1768, Anza had been ordered to campaign against the raiding Seri tribes of Cerro Prieto and Tiburon. This campaign pulled resources away from the defense of Primera Alta. Overall, it was a botched campaign by the Spanish. The general in charge of the campaign would start to lose his grip on reality before finally suffering a mental breakdown and being removed from command. And by 1770, the Spanish had resorted to guerrilla tactics against the Seris, who threatened to ally with other hostile tribes. Eventually, though, Anza would be ordered back to Tubac to deal with these other hostile tribes. By June 1770, Anza thought he had brought some order back and had subdued the Papago nation, until July proved him wrong with what would become known as the Sonita Massacre. In 1771, several hundred Seris would surrender. and Anza's efforts would not go unnoticed by the crown, and he would begin petitioning for a promotion. By 1770, he had already served 17 years, 10 as captain, and he'd be promoted to the captain of the military cavalry. The Franciscans, who replaced the Jesuits, blamed the military's inability to protect the frontier for why their evangelism efforts had failed. Anza blamed the mission system. The Jesuits had enjoyed significant control over the lives of their charges and were in charge of the secular and ecclesiastical administration of the missions. These broad powers, Anza believed, had soured relations with the Spanish populations as the missions blocked access to potentially profitable lands. This limited interaction, in his opinion, between indigenous and Spaniard also made it hard to integrate the various tribes. Furthermore, the expulsion of the Jesuits had just brought ethnic tensions back to the surface. The expulsion had also brought secular control of the missions, which the Padres chafed under, complaining that they were not receiving enough funds. In 1769, they temporarily regained their old empowerment. In 1772, Anza would submit a scathing criticism of the Franciscans and the mission system. Instead of the Franciscan system of reducción, he argued that the indigenous people be completely immersed in European society. Anza understood well that access to European goods, economic advancement, and protection would make the Spanish far more welcome in the area than a heavy boot. He thought this immersion was the way to provide those items. While these ideals seem enlightened, it was probably more practical than enlightened that led them. He understood that the tribes of Sonora would be needed as military allies to defend it. The strategy of peace by purchase was something that he would bring to New Mexico with great success. There he showed the promise of trade was more powerful than the threat of war. In 1774, he received orders to establish a route to Alta California. His work at this in 1774 and 1776 may be one of his most celebrated achievements. There were also dreams among the Sonora colonists to expand into the Gila and Colorado River valleys, using this trail as a part of it. The confluence of the Gila and Colorado rivers was seen as a springboard route to Alta California. It was mostly due to Russian excursions further south from Alaska in the 1760s that lit a fire under the Spanish authorities to colonize Alta California at all. Spain also determined England to be the greatest threat to the colonies, as they had repeatedly tried to take Spanish land in the New World during various wars, eventually succeeding in taking Florida in 1763. The winds and tides along the west coast would blow ships off course when moving to Alta California, making a land route instead of a sea route from Baja California a more palatable option. In January 1774, Anza set out on his expedition. He noted the abundance of water and good land at Yuma. They also struggled with the dunes further on. He quickly realized a settlement at Yuma would be necessary for this route to be successful. Beyond the dunes and deserts of the Imperial Valley, he directed his men northwest through the Anza Borrego Desert, then over the San Jacinto Mountains into the Los Angeles Basin, then on to San Gabriel, and ultimately Monterey. Although the native guide from California, Tarabal, guided the expedition, was the one mostly responsible for the route, Anza gets all of the billing for it. Anza made plans after his return to Sonora in May of 1774 to head to Mexico City for another promotion. However, he was delayed when he was ordered to help restore order in Sonora by inspecting the presidios and to implement the Ruby's reforms of 1772. Part of this would make him deal with a fellow captain, Vitasola, who had married his niece and then abandoned her upon discovering she had committed adultery and was pregnant. They had tried to convince him to reunite with her, though, but due to his refusal, both the Anzas and the Tatos, the other side of his niece's family, had turned on Vitasola. Vitasola had been arrested for corruption, though, in large part due to this spat. Anza probably feared the whole affair would tarnish his reputation, so he told the viceroy he was being delayed by his commander. The viceroy demanded Anza be released to go to Mexico City, allowing him to escape from this delicate situation. While in Mexico City, Anza was declared a hero and rubbed shoulders with the well-to-do of the city. His enemies in Sonora were not idle, though. They attempted to discredit him. Anza and Fray Francisco Garces butted heads on the best route from Sonora to New Mexico. Garces, who we'll talk about later, preferred a route up the Colorado from Yuma and then across from the latitude of the Hopi Pueblos, creating a kind of web tying all the frontier provinces together. The governor of Sonora also preferred this route to Anza's, as he hoped to be chosen over Anza for the colonizing expedition. Commandant Inspector Hugo O'Connor also preferred this route for more practical reasons. Donald C. Cutter lays the reasoning out. Quote, his job as a senior military officer, assigned to implement a new defensive scheme for the northernmost portion of a far-flung colonial empire, was to ensure its security both in the present and foreseeable future. Even though O'Connor had no direct connection with the major frontier expansion into the new area of Upper California that was taking place, the troops under his general control were involved in seeking a trail to transport colonists from the relatively settled area of Sonora to the hinterland of what would one day become the Golden State. It was expansion beyond the Ruby Plan that caused it, the plan, to have some unforeseen weaknesses. Certainly any ideas of expansion of the frontier were beyond the imagination of O'Connor, whose time and energy were consumed by the constant urgency of holding off the Apache invasion of existing settlements." End quote. O'Connor had been disappointed with the two-back garrison when he had toured it in 1775 and found discipline lacking and officers corrupt. Despite this corruption, though, Anza was again chosen to head for the Pacific coast. In October 1775, he rode out at the head of some 249 men, women, and children, mostly from Sinaloa. By November, they camped at Yuma. Here, Garces and Tomas Yexark arranged to remain among the Quechans. Garces had been informed that his route was not to be established unless first there was a mission front among the tribes of the Yuma and Gila River valleys. However, he demanded that he be allowed to go to the Hopi pueblos. He was forced to turn around, though, after his arrival, but he was able to send a letter from the Hopis to Zuni. It was also revealed that for his dream to come true, the Hopi would have to be subdued and brought back into the Spanish fold, something Anza would attempt during his governorship. Anza would meet with the Quechan chief Salvador Palma as they left, and he would remind Anza of a Spanish promise to establish a colony at Yuma. The winter weather unexpectedly turned cold, though, once they continued on. They crossed the Colorado Desert in 4 parties, spread out at one-day intervals to not deplete the wells that existed. As they crossed the desert, they would get caught in a blizzard. They arrived in January 1776, where the colonists would go on to establish the Presidio and settlement among the San Francisco Bay. Anza would return to Mexico City for another promotion. The Hopi would continue to refuse Christianity, thus forcing the Spanish to rely on Anza's route to California, which only needed the Spanish to befriend the Quechans. Without the land at Yuma, he did not believe that the route could be sustained. The Spanish had won over Chief Salvador Palma, whom they considered key to this alliance, to their side with promises of trade and goods. The Spanish officials failed to make the promised colony appear, though, and missions were founded in the 1780s which demanded food, land, and obedience in exchange for spiritual salvation, something the Quechans weren't really interested in. On June 17th, 1781, the Quechans attacked, turning hostile against the Spanish. 100 Europeans would die or go missing as a result, including Garces. From David J. Weber, quote, "Spanish arrogance, failed promises, corporal punishment, and demands for food and arable land had roused anger throughout the Yuma community, alienating even the cooperative Salvador Palma. For their part, the Franciscans blamed Teodoro de Croix for sanctioning a low-budget enterprise and for limiting their control over the temporal lives of the Yumas in violation of custom and law. Croix blamed Anza and the Franciscans for misrepresenting Yuma docility." End quote. This would really be the end of Spanish attempts to establish settlements in the area. There were other priorities, such as the violence again breaking out in Sonora, that took up Spanish authorities' attention. However, Anza's time working to solve Sonora's problems were coming to end. I'm going to bring this episode to a close here. Next time, we'll talk about Anza's tenure as governor of New Mexico. I also want to note I've got about 4 or so episodes between this one and bringing up the end of the Spanish colonial period, where we'll summarize one last time before we launch into the Mexican period. If you have any questions for the Q&A, you should submit them to our show via our website at engineeringfire.org or to the show's email, michael@engineeringfire.org. If you enjoyed the show, please share it with your friends. Leave a review on your podcast app of choice if it lets you. Since I'm a Luddite and don't use social media, word of mouth and reviews are the only way the show spreads. We have a website located at engineeringfire.org. That's spelled engineeringfire.org, where I have a link in the header for podcast resources, including pictures, companion posts, my bibliography, and the transcripts of each show. We have an email you can submit comments and questions to at michael@engineeringfire.org. The intro music is Desperados by Frank Schroeder and sourced from filmmusic.io. The outro music is NeoWestern from Kevin McLeod of Incompetech. Links to all things mentioned are present in the show notes and at the website. Thank you all so much for listening, and I will see you in the next episode.